Good afternoon, and welcome to Responding to COVID-19, a dialogue with foundation leaders. My name is Jean Bell. I direct the Advancing Practice program here at the Nonprofit Quarterly. Welcome. We know this is an extremely intense time for people, an exhausting time both professionally for many of you, if you're indeed still employed, and certainly personally with caregiving and social distancing, et cetera. We hope today that we can kind of exhale for a minute together and have a thoughtful conversation about one of the kind of pillars of our ecosystem of civil society, which is institutional philanthropy, and what is its role in a pandemic like this. What are some thoughtful foundation executives doing about COVID-19? What can we learn that may serve us in the future? And also a little bit of guidance to you if you are in fact grant seeking in this complex time. So thank you for being here. You see that we have a sponsor for today's webinar, which allows us to bring it to you free of charge. We're really grateful to Church Mutual Insurance, which has been insuring nonprofits and human service organizations and providing them risk management resources for over 120 years. So thank you very much for that sponsorship. You also see that we have a hashtag if you're going to be on social media sharing these insights, your opinions. Please use NPQ COVID. Let me go over some logistics with you about how this webinar is going to work. Like all of our webinars, this session is being recorded. So everybody who's here today will receive a recording, and the recording will also be up and available to the general public. That takes us about a couple of days, so look out for it. You see that you have a Q&A box there that Zoom provides. Please use that to enter your questions as they arise for you, and I'll be our moderator today, posing them to our panelists intermittently, and then we're trying really hard to save a chunk of time at the end for your questions as well. As always, we have a brief evaluation that will pop up as soon as the session ends, and we greatly value your feedback, not only on how today's conversation goes, but really importantly for us, what else you want to see from us in our coverage of COVID and its implications. So thank you in advance for doing that. And again, if you're using social media, our hashtag is NPQ COVID. So what I'm going to ask is that our three panelists briefly introduce themselves. We've got leaders with local and regional and national, international perspective here today. And if you could just each share your name, role, of course, and just briefly sort of the thrust or core programming of your foundation, that will get us started. And Sam Cobb, can I start with you, please?
Yes, thank you for having me today, Jean. It is a pleasure to be here. Hopefully everyone is healthy and safe. So I am the CEO of Tipping Point Community. We are a philanthropic organization that is based in the San Francisco Bay Area. We're a philanthropic organization with a pretty interesting model. We don't have an endowment, and so we raise all of our money each year. We give all of that money out in the next year in the form of unrestricted grants. And we have a very generous board of directors who underwrites all of our operating costs. And so every dollar that we raise, there are no fees. Every dollar goes out the door in the next year. Typically, we put out somewhere close to, on average, about $50 million a year. Other years, a little bit more. So thank you for having me again.
Thank you, Sam. And Justin, can you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Hi. It's a pleasure to be here as well. I'm the CEO at a foundation in Winston-Salem, the Babcock Foundation. We work across 11 states in the American South. Our work is about trying to help advance the people and places out of poverty and achieve greater racial, social, and economic justice. We're issue agnostic, so we try to understand the context in a place and listen hard to our partners in that place to understand where there's real opportunity and then support them. We generally support networks with multi-year general support grants, but also have a PRI portfolio, our 100% values-aligned investment portfolio. We bring our relational capital and other tools to our partners as well. To give you a sense of scale, we were a $200 million foundation, and now not as much. We have a cross-cutting interest in power building in low wealth communities and in communities of color. And we believe that data and lots of experience supports the idea that as goes the South, so goes the country. So that's the Babcock Foundation.
Great. And can you share with us, what's your, how much of the South do you fund? What's your geographic catchment?
It's 11 states. So if you imagine the South without Florida and Texas, we're everything in between those states.
Super. Thank you. Very helpful. And Hilary, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Hi, thanks for having me also, and thanks to everyone who's joined us. I'm Hilary Pennington. I'm the Executive Vice President of Programs for the Ford Foundation. And the Ford Foundation is a big, old global foundation. We have operations here in the US and in 10 countries around the world. And we have one primary focus, which is working to reduce inequality and the political and economic and cultural forms of exclusion that drive it. We have been around for 80 years. We started after World War II. We've changed and evolved a lot over the course of our history, but really have always had a central focus on supporting ideas and individuals through lots of different kinds of fellowship programs over time, and then institutions, organizations. And that is our primary focus today. And we work on a range of kinds of issues that have to do with fighting inequality.
Thank you. So we're thrilled that all three of you are here, and in preparing for today's conversation, I know that all three of you have a lot of values alignment, a lot of experience in responding to poverty and injustice, and you also have been using different strategies as this pandemic has unfolded, appropriate to your various core missions, et cetera. So we'll get into that. And the way we're going to sort of design this conversation is around four big questions. The first is kind of a 30,000-foot question. What's the role of institutional philanthropy in a crisis of this scale? Then we're going to drill into what is it that your foundations are doing. The third question is around, well, could these emergency responses, or what maybe are being characterized as short-term responses to COVID, could they help us look at the long-term behavior of philanthropy? Are there improvements or challenges that you see coming out of this pandemic in the long term? And then for grant seekers, we want to talk a little bit about what guidance you might have in this kind of unprecedented time of trying to raise funds to meet this demand. So let's start with the first question on the next slide, and I'm going to start with Sam. I mean, I want to be specific about this, and not individual to your foundations. We've heard that government's response or responsibility is to be prepared. It wasn't. Government's response perhaps was to keep people employed. They haven't. We're at 17 million new unemployment in the last 4 weeks. So we've had some interesting levels of preparation and strategy, at least at the federal level. Of course, it's looking very different at the counties and states depending on their particular politics and resources. But I want to drill into how you view institutional philanthropy's role in a crisis of this scale, Sam.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And so I think the way that I think about institutional philanthropy's role in a crisis of this scale goes a little bit back to the way that I think about institutional philanthropy in general. Is that what often institutional philanthropy does is it has the opportunity to understand what are the gaps in the safety net, what are the gaps in the system, and then help to actually understand what is needed to fill those gaps. And then hopefully government can take over and expand that or scale that. And that's the way that I think philanthropy should work. And so in a crisis, I think our role is pretty similar. Is that first of all, we need to understand where is there suffering, where is it that we're needed the most, and I think philanthropy has the unique ability of being agile and being quick. And so I'm new to philanthropy. I've only been in this role for a couple of months. I've been with the organization for a couple of years now, and I always thought philanthropy was slow, but we're a lot faster than government. And so that our ability to be agile and to get dollars out on the street to organizations who are propping up people that we know that there is a government intervention going to come at some point. And so what is it that we can do to sustain the country and sustain the environment until that solution comes. The other thing, though, that I think we have to be very careful of is not to get too quick on what our immediate response is, because we also understand from the way that our government operates that there are going to be some people who are possibly going to be left out of the government intervention. And so we have to keep some of our powder dry to understand who's left out and how do we get resources. And I didn't say that tipping point, we're all about fighting and defeating poverty. And we're thinking about how do we make sure that the people who are left out of the government interventions, how are they getting taken care of as well so that they can sustain themselves and their families as we go forward. And then the last thing I'd like to say on this is one of the things that we can also do is we can lead the way. I am very interested, and it's been curious how as Philanthropy, as we've been having conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, really kind of propping up since 2016. But the behavior that I'm seeing a little bit right now is that all of those things are out the door, right? And so there's a reason why comfort food is called comfort food, is because when we're stressed and when things aren't normal, we like to go to the things that give us comfort. And oftentimes those things that give us comfort are the old ways of operating, our old defaults of how we select grantees, how we get money out the door, how restrictive we get with the dollars that we get out the door. And so that's the other thing that Philanthropy can do, is continue to guide the way for government and other philanthropists as we get through this, as we try to get through this crisis.
Yeah, there's a tension between speed and equity for sure, right? And what are our sort of default reactions to things? Thank you. Hilary, what would you build on there or add from your perspective? How do you see philanthropy's role?
Well, I love everything that Sam just said. So ditto that. And I guess I'd add three things. One is we should get more money to grantees fast. So I think where possible, we should increase or at least maintain our current spending levels. So that's, even though our values are declining in the market. And second, and I think in some ways as important, we need to make sure that we spend smarter. We can't fill every emergency need in a time like this. So we have to be smart in how we spend. And there, I think, it's really important to take the kinds of actions represented in that pledge that's on the Council on Foundations website that over 600 foundations have signed so far. It's words, but they matter. And that pledge says we commit to convert project support to general support. We commit to extend the length of grants, loosen unnecessary restrictions, simplify and speed up our processes, and also choose for organizations and communities that are closest to the problems and to the pain. And I think we have to be smarter in what we focus on. Our unique benefit as a sector is that we should be able to help both bend the curve towards equity and justice, and also to see around the curve. We are the institutional actors who are uniquely able not to focus just on responding to crises because we're not subject to elections or short-term market pressure. So how can we help transform these crises, a crisis like this, to help a more just economic and political and global world order emerge or be created out of this moment? And I think that puts a lot of pressure on us to understand that we, even though we're uniquely situated to see around the curve, it doesn't mean we should be the only ones doing that from our lofty perch of privilege. Especially in a time like this, philanthropy cannot and should not play an elite role. So how do we push ourselves to make the places where we look for solutions more diverse and more democratic and more powerful, instead of doing what Sam says is our tendency, which is to go back to our comfort ways? Everything we know about resilient ecosystems, the ones that survive disruption, is that they favor diversity and their innovation comes from the margins. So we as funders need to understand that if we only double down on our existing grantees, then we ourselves are going to increase inequality, because we will systematically underinvest in organizations that are led by communities of color, as one example, which are people of color are almost half the population in the United States, but organizations led by people of color receive only 7% of total philanthropic dollars. So unless we push ourselves in a time of crisis not to go to our familiar grantees, but to expand who we fund, we will miss innovation and will deepen inequality.
Thank you. Justin, let me get your thoughts here, and then we can process some of what's been said here. What do you see as the role, in addition to what Hilary and Sam, or differently than what they've said?
Sure, I appreciate all that was said for sure. I was scared for our democracy before this crisis, and now I'm terrified. I think this is probably the most important year for our democracy in my lifetime, and not just in the South. The census, elections, implications for redistricting, it feels incredibly dangerous to me not to do every single thing we can to support deep and broad efforts to build power. So I think foundations have got to do more to lean into supporting long-term systems change work, even in a crisis, help support communities of color and low wealth communities in particular, engage in power building, engage in policy change, engage in advocacy. Specifically, I think we got to help provide resources to support experimentation for those groups that are doing civic engagement and advocacy and door knocking and canvassing. Those things are off the table. So the sort of resources they need to experiment, at least in the near term, with digital organizing and other forms of protecting fair elections is just key, and strengthen the infrastructure organizations that help low wealth communities and organizations that help bring communities of color to civic engagement feels key to me. And not all philanthropy, I think, thinks about both what's the short-term response, but how do we think about needs in a long-term frame? So to do that, I think best, we gotta trust and support our partners on the ground. We as philanthropists, I'm pretty sure, don't know best. My experience as somebody who serves on the boards is the lead staff of a foundation, of a board. We always think we know more than we do. And so getting proximate to the problem, connecting with people on the ground and supporting them, believing what they say about what the problems are, feels critical to me, particularly in a crisis. So there's this a little bit of tension in the, getting as connected to as possible to communities, particularly those that I think feel the disproportionate impact of this crisis, particularly African-American communities. I'm listening to them, but also investing in the organizations with the resources to help engage in that democratic work that's so necessary this year, and we can't let it slip from climate change to, you can pick any issue that is at risk this year, and it feels critical we don't let that democratic practice slide.
Yeah, I think this was going to be an important year pre-COVID, and now not only is it super important, but the methodologies, our go-to methodologies for engagement are necessarily being challenged or transformed in real time, is what I hear you saying. And I also hear a tension in what all of you are saying between responding to existing grantees, dealing with the urgent, and also looking around the corner. At the quarterly, we've been thinking about, of course, we have to cover the immediacy. What are we doing? The urgency. But we also have to cover, what are we doing? What is the what is the opportunity for policy change, for narrative change inside a crisis? And I hear that in all of your answers. We'll come back to some of this some more, but I want to go on to the next question and hear some of the specific strategies that you're using. So Justin, I think at Babcock, you basically are working in 4 areas to respond to COVID. Can you share those 4 strategies with us?
Yeah, we talked to a bunch of grantees early on as this was evolving, unfolding, and heard 2 big things. One was just the straight up economic distress. They had to cancel fundraisers. They were hearing from their supporters about retrenching their support. They were adding new expenses, having to work at home, new technology, so just economic concern. Second thing was organizations are totally having to reimagine and reconstruct their strategy and program, particularly those engaged in work where interaction is key. So what was clear to us from past disasters is that cash is king in a crisis. So we did 4 things. We made immediate emergency 10,000 grants to all of our grantee partners to help with those. How do we work at home? How do we help support their staff in this hard time? We front loaded and extended the majority of all of our grantees with an extra year of grant. That was for us, we're a reasonably small foundation, but because we so significantly support civic engagement organizations in this year and community development, financial institutions who are on the front lines of engaging with their low income and small business borrowers, that cash would be critical to them. The third thing we did is put investments in 10 place-based COVID response the funds across the South. These were funds connected to organizations and strategies we were already supporting on the ground, but what we agree, we can't be the direct need or address it. We felt like it was important to make a contribution. And the last thing we did is we eliminated the interest on all of our PRIs and converted 20% of those loans to grants. And that was just an acknowledgement, particularly in low-income rural communities, that CDFIs are so critical to a resilient economy that we wanted to make grant funds immediately available to them as their balance sheets are at risk.
Great. So just to summarize, $10,000 unrestricted grants to all existing grantees, extended existing grants by 1 year, made one-time gifts to a whole host of emergency funds across your region that you fund in, and lowered the interest rate and converted some to grants on your PRI investments. Is that right? Great. Hilary, let's go to you. What are some of the responses that Ford has had?
Well, I love and admire what Justin, you all have done. You know, we make about 1,000 grants a year. We have 3,000 active grants, just about, all over the world. So one of the things that's been really challenging for us is just how to get our heads around this. You know, we first saw this happen in China, and we set up an extra fund for grants in China, and now it's everywhere, and we can't respond just by that. So, you know, the first thing we did was just really quickly reach out to all of our grantees and change our processes internally in some of the ways I was describing about the COVID pledge. So converting project support to general support, trying to understand the extra expenses that they had, making whatever adjustments we could to any requirements of existing grants that we had. Second is just to move our own bureaucracy to get more money out more quickly. In the last month, we approved, just in the last month alone, 158 grants, over $80 million, which is 3 times the amount that we approved in the same period last year. And we've gotten so that we can, between when we ask for a proposal to when the money lands in the grantee's bank account, our record for that has been to do that in a 5-day turnaround on a couple of recent grants. So we're trying to get better and better about those systems. It's a huge amount of work for our staff who are home with children and families and their own illnesses, but you know, you feel consumed with the need to try to get your partners the support that they need. Like Justin described, most of the kinds of organizations Ford funds work on issues of power and organizing, you know, democracy and the economy, and they are really important now, and they're facing really existential crises. And then the last thing we've done is to really try to focus on our role beyond money and the relationships that we have and ability to convene others. So we played a role together with all the foundations in trust-based philanthropy in pulling together that COVID pledge. We've worked to create a number of multi-million-dollar funds, a $70 million fund in New York City at the New York Community Trust, a $50 million fund that will get announced next week that focuses on low-wage workers and the needs that they have in this economy, and not only their needs in the short term, but their ability to organize and advocate for policy change and structural change in the long term, to make sure that their ability to do things like that is resourced for all the reasons that we've just talked about. And we also have suspended requirements for paying back PRIs. We make a lot of PRIs as well.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you so much. And Sam, your model is a little different. You're leveraging high net worth individuals and other individual donors largely. Tell us briefly how you are responding at Tipping Point Community.
So yeah, thank you. So some of the things that I would say more traditional philanthropy is doing in a responding or have been things that Tipping Point has always done. We've always given out unrestricted general operating grants. Yes, we have programmatic goals, but where you spend the dollars and how you spend the dollars is totally up to, and when you spend the dollars is totally up to our grantee leaders. When we think about our diversity of our portfolio, I think right now we're probably at about 40, maybe 45% of our groups are led by people of color, and about 91% of the people that they're serving are also people of color. And so really digging into the idea of closing the gap around inequities, both from a direct service and a policy perspective. And so when this crisis hit, we understood a few things at the time. And so one was we understood that there were going to be people, usually the first impacted or the last to recover. And those are hourly workers and those people who are living right around the poverty level, if not below the poverty level. We know that in the region that we work in, the Bay Area, that only 1 in 5 people don't have $400 in the bank, and that they cannot withstand an emergency. Not only can they not withstand an emergency where their hours have gotten eliminated or totally cut. Before this, they couldn't withstand an emergency of a parking boot on their car. And so we knew that we needed to get dollars out. We needed to get dollars out to them and to get them out to them quickly. And so what we did is we launched a $30 million fund. We launched that fund about a week and a half ago. Today, we hit our $15 million mark. And the way that we're actually using this fund is thinking about it in 3 ways. And one is, what is that immediate response? And that is, again, getting dollars into the hands of people who need it right now. The second is, what does the recovery look like? And so that we know that the nonprofits that we work with, that, as Justin said, they've had to cancel events. We know that it was going to be a tough year for them anyway, because as we think about protecting our democracy, that we know that nonprofits sometimes get a 20 to 30% decrease during presidential election years because people are funding their favorite candidate, regardless of what party you are. And so that dries up individual donations. But the fact that they've had to cancel their events, also, we know that a lot of our groups get dollars from government. But if you're unable to perform, government doesn't usually pay based on an outcome, they pay based on an output. And if you're at home and you can't work because of whatever the service is that you render, there is no output. And that we knew that organizations were going to have huge holes in revenue. And so the recovery part is, how do we stabilize the ecosystem of nonprofits in the Bay Area, starting with the 60 or so groups that we fund. And then finally, the rebuild phase. What is that longer tail? And I like the way that Justin and Hilary started to talk about the policy and the systems change piece of it, right? And so what is it? We talk about going back to normal, but we don't want all things to go back to normal. And I think there's some of the things that we're doing right now from a policy perspective that a lot of us have been advocating for years to have happen. And so this is our opportunity. And even with our homeless crisis in the Bay Area, all of a sudden we have empty buildings and empty places where we can erect facilities that a month and a half ago, those places weren't there. And so how do we take advantage of this moment around not wasting you should never waste a good crisis. And so how do we not waste this crisis and just be focused on the short term, but also on the long term. And so our donors and our community is responding in a huge way. And as I said, a week and a half or so in, we're at the $15 million mark. And I know that living in California, that sometimes one of the worst things about this pandemic is that I can't get to the East Coast, and I don't talk as much to people on the East Coast to understand that I may live in a bubble. But even when we're reaching out to our donors and we're getting no's, or they're not investing in the way that we expected or would typically want them to invest, the reason why they're giving us the no's are for good reasons. They're giving us no's, or that they can't come in at a particular level because they understand and they're taking care of their workforce of hourly employees. And so when Twitter shut down, one of the things that it said was that it was going to extend the same benefits to its contracted workers as it did its salaried workers. And so those are the things that not only give me pause, but make me very optimistic that we can take this moment, and yes, we need to respond to it short term, but how do we also respond in thinking about how do we respond long term? For anyone who lives in the Bay Area, you get caught up in the Caldecott Tunnel every once in a while. And last year they finished a fourth bore. That means that they didn't have to stop traffic one way during peak times. And that fourth bore was funded during the 2008 crisis. And so how do we use this crisis to do things long term that we've long wanted to do is one of the other things in the way that we're responding as well.
Thank you. And that's a perfect segue to our next question. Some people who missed the beginning are just asking me to remind where folks are from. So Justin is from Mary Reynolds Babcock Foundation, funding in a number of states in the South. Hilary is from Ford Foundation, U.S. and International, and Sam is from Tipping Point Community, which raises and distributes funds in the Bay Area. And that was a perfect segue, Sam, to what I hope is another rich part of this conversation, which is, can this change philanthropy in the long term? This crisis is colliding with what has been an increasingly loud set of demands for philanthropic reform and shifts and critiques both from within and without philanthropy about how it works, who it funds, how it funds them, et cetera. And so I'm curious to hear what each of you think about the possibilities, what Sam just said. Can we look around the curve and make some changes in how philanthropy works because of this, or is that pie in the sky? This is a quote from Boulay, who I know many of you follow on social media, who is being especially pointed with his crappy practices and good practices campaign right now around philanthropy. So with him as our inspiration here, how can this change philanthropy long term? And Hilary, I'll start with you. What do you see as possible, if anything?
Well, let me talk about what's possible, but I think it's going to take a lot to make the possible probable. I think we have to be really clear that the whole sector we fund will look really different coming out of this than it did going in. This is going to be a terrible, terrible time for the kinds of organizations we all fund. So I think we have to stay close to them over this period of time and learn from them. We've talked a lot about the need for more general operating support. Let's just start there. I think support that goes to organizations that trust that they know best, as Sam and Justin have said, how to fix the problems they're trying to work on is really critical. And foundations have claimed a lot of barriers to keep them from making support like that. It's not strategic. We can't still be accountable to our boards. We have a strategy. How can we have the grantees lead the strategy? All of those things should really be challenged by this. And it is possible to do general operating support and still be accountable and still have a strategy and still listen to your grantees. So I think that's a kind of change that one would hope to see. We have learned from our own efforts to do that and from our BUILD program, though, that as important, and in fact more important for most of our grantees, is that those grants are not just general operating support, but they're multi-year, 5-year grants. And I think that is the thing I would hope we can change, because it's impossible for organizations to pivot and adapt in a crisis or to skate ahead of the puck in these kinds of systemic ways that we are all talking about if they get a grant, even if it's a general operating grant, if they get it on a 1-year basis. So that would be one thing that I hope happens. And I think it's going to take also grantees and publications like yours to hold us accountable. We need a watchdog to make sure that the virtue signaling that we're all massively doing right now ends up in actions that stick. And then I think the other thing I would hope is that we do work a lot harder to find organizations that are closest to the challenges, as we've been talking about, and to choose for organizations led by women and people of color and help them play the long-term as well as the short-term game. Because in the end, it's not just how does philanthropy change, it's how does our society decide to change? What do we decide we value and who do we value? So I think, when I'll just 3 quick examples of grantees we have that are led by women of color. United We Dream. They work with dreamers. They are not providing direct service and direct relief to undocumented workers and their families. They weren't doing that before the crisis, and they're not doing it now, but they're really trying to work to bend the curve for the future. So to change our culture, change our policies regarding undocumented immigrants, so they're not so systematically disenfranchised. Or NDWA, the National Domestic Workers Alliance, which is working so well and passionately to change how we see and value and pay and protect domestic workers. Or a big old organization like Consumer Reports, which is taking its work to a whole new level that this moment requires. They're not just rating toaster ovens and cars, but they're figuring out how to organize consumer pressure for things like protecting people from fraudulent, predatory, and deceptive products and policies, helping them provide temporary waivers for utility bills and rent and mortgage and student loan and debt payments, stopping credit agencies from reporting negative information. So I think helping our grantees play the long game as well as the short game is really, really important, because everything we know from past recovery efforts, whether it's Katrina or Sandy or 2008, recovery does not necessarily happen in equitable ways. It tends to reinforce inequities that existed before things even began. So we have to create space and opportunity for organizations that are in crisis themselves to develop the relationships and the thinking that will be longer term. And I think all of that should require us to focus in a much more service-oriented way to the organizations that we fund, and hopefully have it be less about us and more about them.
Great. Thank you for lifting up the length of grants, not just the level of restriction. I think that's an important point. And I know you've talked about that with your build capacity building program, but there is something transformative about, and multi-year, a lot of people think 2-year, they don't think 5 years. So I think I want to underscore what you're saying. That is a different model. Anyway, you're talking about grant making practice. You're also talking about funding the long game, and you're also talking about the way you relate to your grantees. At least those were 3 big buckets I heard that could continue to change. Sam, what would you add in terms of, can this change how philanthropy works long term?
Yeah, there's not much I can add to that. I think Hilary did a great job of summing that up. The 2 pieces that I would kind of recommend. One is that all of the things that Hilary just talked about were things that philanthropy has been talking about it should do for a while now.
Yep.
But its
Amen.
actions and its rhetoric hasn't necessarily aligned. And so we know what should be done. We know what could be done. But how do we then align our actions, our goals, and what it is that we're doing? How do we align those? And so hopefully that this crisis is an accelerant of that it points out where we should be focused, how we should be focused, how we should be engaging with leaders who are proximate on the ground and understand what's happening in those communities. And how do we begin to dismantle some of those things that we say we want to happen in one area, but then we put obstacles up in another area. And so an example of that is the whole idea of scale, right? That I don't personally think that nonprofits scale. I think they get bigger. I think practices scale. And so when you want to fund a organization or a leader because they understand what's happening in Oakland, California, but then you say that, hey, they can't scale, we really want them to go to Houston. What they would say is that I am proximate to Oakland. I want to help solve the issues of Oakland. I don't know anything about Houston. So the reason that we want to fund them and we want to focus on they know what's happening best, we rule them out of getting our dollars because they don't know this other place. And so how do we align our actions with our rhetoric? The thing that I hope doesn't change, and this has been a conversation that I've been a part of, is that during this crisis, how we gauge success is going to go somewhat from an outcomes perspective to, in some ways, an output perspective, right? How many people are getting fed? How many people do we prevent from becoming homeless? What I want to make sure that we do is that we continue to focus on not just who we're funding, but the outcomes that our funding is actually producing for that end user. And so we have conversations sometimes about the social entrepreneur. And is it that we care about the social entrepreneur, or do we care about who it is that the social entrepreneur is serving? And so a tipping point is much more about that end user and making sure that we are continuing to hold ourselves and others accountable for the outcomes that we want to see happen for those communities. And what I've heard, and which is definitely has not been my experience, is that proximate leaders don't want to measure outcomes. No, that is not true. Proximate leaders have not been invested in to build a muscle, to build the infrastructure, to build all of those things that they need to measure the outcomes that they actually care about. And so I think we have to lean into that. And that's what I hope doesn't change, is that our view on outcomes and funding what's work, and not necessarily growing organizations, but growing practices that can work in different places is what I think is a little bit of a longer view for philanthropy as we go forward.
Thank you so much. And I know that questions about data and evaluation and learning can seem out of place in a moment of urgency. And what I hear you correcting for is that actually it's asking the people proximate what it is they want to learn and investing in their learning that is as relevant as ever. Justin, what would you build on? I know data is important to you too, but thinking about how you hope or believe this can change philanthropic practice, given that it's colliding with what was already an escalating demand for change.
Gosh, there's so many things to say, and I know we don't have a lot of time. I guess I would just say, like, this moment so underscores why supporting marginalized communities' engagement and power building, like influencing $2 trillion, helping create conditions where we have elected leaders who are more prepared to take on these sorts of challenges. Like, I just think philanthropy has to recognize that power building is a doable, realistic, practical, and possible bucket of strategies, goals, and outcomes. With real investment in community leaders, we can see real progress. And there are just hundreds of examples across the country. And, you know, philanthropy's often afraid of it, particularly mainstream philanthropy. So I'll say that. And I think to do that, just as both my colleagues have said, we've got to center our grantee partners, build our relationships to them, and trust them and resource them. It's less for me a question of how this happens, but what will it take? And I just think that that's a more complicated question. I think our philanthropy support organizations are beginning to do a good job at holding us accountable. I think the media, NPQ is a great example, can play a role in that. I think we got to do more without rating nonprofits to get nonprofit leaders in philanthropic seats to help make this transition real.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So that whole strategy around power building, and know that it's actually a set of practices and a lot of leaders on the ground doing it that needs investment, and addressing the fear that some foundations and foundation boards in particular may have in calling it power building and investing in it. Let's go quickly to the fourth question, which is about grant seeking. What a intense time for people who rely on philanthropic support. Hilary, you talked about your inbox flooding with requests for additional funding from existing grantees. I'm sure a lot of you are experiencing that. Some of you have already responded with emergency grants. How are you thinking about, what one or two things briefly would you suggest about the reality of grant seeking in this moment?
You're asking me?
I am.
You know, I ran a nonprofit for 20 years, and I think that this is such a hard time. So I don't think it's a good time for blind emails or panicked emails to your funders. I think you will help yourselves best if you can somehow, and I know it's hard, step back to take the time to make a realistic plan. And when you reach out to your funders, especially your existing funders, to ask them to help you, show them what you've planned to do already and how you're thinking about the kind of help you would need. I think especially, you know, Sam talked about how families don't have money to survive a crisis, neither do nonprofits. And that is, again, you know, part of our fault as funders for how we fund them. But almost no nonprofits have 3 years of reserves in the bank, you know, 3 years of monthly expenses in reserve in their bank accounts, right? And so if this goes on with, so I think ask for not only for the present, but ask your funders to help you build up a reserve. Get on that Council of Foundations website and read that pledge and know that you have a right to ask for those things, and you should. And keep track of those 600 funders who said that they would do those things, and make sure that they do. And then I think don't hesitate to ask your funders to use their social capital too, you know, to get on the phone on your behalf and try to help you out with other funders and drawing you to the attention of other funders, because it is a hard time in which to make a relationship with a new funder. And to the degree that your existing funders can help open the doors for you, you should ask them to.
Thank you. So I heard 3 strategies just to summarize. First of all, have a plan, not to reach out even to an existing funder with what should we do? But reach out with here are the scenarios we've identified, and here's how you could support us in that. It still may be a no, but you have a plan. Secondly, is to read that pledge on the Council of Foundation site, acknowledging, as Sam and others have in this discussion, that the space between rhetoric and action can be awfully wide. What you're suggesting from kind of an advocacy perspective is use that language back with your funders and hold at least those 600 funders who've signed on to that pledge to those precepts or concepts that are outlined in that pledge. And then third, to ask your existing funders to use social capital on your behalf where appropriate. Justin, can I go to you in terms of what you might add to that list of guidance to grant seekers?
I mean, I think those are great ideas. I don't really have a lot to add. I do think it's a hard time to try to develop new relationships and to cut through the static. So going back to your existing funders feels key. Even talking to some of your existing partners and who their funders are. I did a lot of fundraising in partnership with other organizations that made the pie higher, not increased our competition. So that feels like a worthwhile collective response.
That's a good idea.
Thank you. So the fourth strategy there is to look to authentic partners who may have existing relationships and you have an authentic reason to work together. Those are 2 big ifs. But if that exists, and often it does in well-networked organizations, maybe there's something you can propose together. Sam, how about you? How do you think about responding to grant seekers right now? What guidance might you offer?
Yeah, I think this is where I would kind of separate a little bit from the group and say that depending on what it is that you do, you have to continue to send those emails and knock on those doors. And so this is coming from my perspective as somewhat an intermediary on the ground. And so at Tipping Point, what we're also doing is I thought about this today. I don't want to fall in love with my portfolio because it's my portfolio. That what I also need to do is to see where is it that we're missing the mark, right? Where is it? Because we had a long-term strategy. We were heading in a certain direction. And now as we get ready to respond to this crisis, definitely from a short-term perspective, where is it that we haven't invested in that it is even more apparent to us right now that we should have? And so for Tipping Point, as an example of that, that is around the issue of food security. right? And so that has come up is a huge piece, not only within the Bay Area, but of other places. Like, how are people getting fed that are living on the margins? How are kids getting fed when they're no longer going to school? And I can tell you, with 2 10-year-olds here, the amount of food that we run through in a week is phenomenal based on when they're going to school and all of these other things. And so we're also looking at what are the populations that we're not hitting that we want to hit during this crisis. What are the types of things that we haven't invested in that maybe right now we should look at investing in. And so I think there is an opportunity there. And so I think one of my favorite authors, Jim Collins, in his book, How the Mighty Fall, it said, let's not fall in love with what we do. Let's just remember why we do it, so that we can get the result that we want. And so I think there are some organizations, some foundations who are continuing to look at where do they have gaps in their funding, or how it is that they're responding that they can feel during this particular time. And so it's definitely something that we're looking at in the Bay Area. It is not the time, though, however, to start pitching your 20-year strategic plan to me. That's not what it is that we're looking for. But it is looking to expand. And again, what are the needs that we have on the ground that we can provide support for people to do right now.
An additional strategy then, and of course, all fundraising has to do with knowing the individuals and the strategies of the foundations. But at least for your foundation, you do have your eyes out for issues that are emerging or showing up differently, or even providers that are emerging that you want to respond to. So it's possible that's an opportunity depending on the funder. We're getting a lot of questions about the endowments, of course, and a number of you have talked about, you have all done additional things beyond your existing grant making. But I wonder if we can, in these last couple minutes, in the spirit of how philanthropy might change, or the constructs that we're so wed to, the perpetuity and the continued sort of growth of our endowments. Can I ask each of you to speak to the notion that we should be dipping into these endowments more than we have to? Justin, is that how your board sees it? Do you see it? Is that the conversation amongst your peers? Are you trying to preserve for the long haul, or are you trying to meet this need?
Our board just generally tries to assess, they care about the endowment and, financial prudence, but weigh impact in a given year against our financial returns. They did it in 2008 and did not retrench, and they're doing it this year. Our payout will be about 12%. And recognize if the market recovers, we will have pulled a lot of cash out of it, and it won't benefit from that additional increase. And I just go back to why we exist and the importance of this year in particular. And the board just decided that perpetuity is not as relevant as the opportunity this year to strengthen organizations who safeguard our democracy at a time where so many key, from the census to the districting, are at stake. So it isn't that there won't be other important things that we need to invest in, but we have the context we have today, and they chose a form of leadership, which was that investment.
Mm-hmm. Hilary, just in a minute or so, what's the conversation there about preserving endowment, meeting the need, bending the curve?
Yep. So just the same as Justin, we're spending more than we have to in payout, and we will continue to do that for very similar sets of reasons. And our board is also open to our coming to them with some kinds of big ideas for yet even a fuller kind of special allocation.
Mm-hmm. As this shifts on a daily basis, I'm curious about how the time horizon is shifting in your conversations. We started a month ago with this is going to be lifted, the social distancing will be lifted in March, now it's April, now it's May. Is it moving on a daily basis amongst your executive staff about thinking about what kind of time horizon we're talking about, and therefore how we even think about stock value, et cetera?
You know, I think because of our experience in China, with our China office, we've always thought that it would be until the fall before things, quote, are more normal, just in terms of how we work. And we, you know, our endowment manager take the long view. You know, even in the best of times, we would use a 3-year rolling average of our endowment returns to make any adjustments at all in our payout. So, you know, we're kind of trying to stick with that. We realize we may end the year, we started the year as an almost $14 billion foundation. We may end the year with our endowment. We may end the year as less than a $10 billion endowment, but it doesn't change what we should do in the world.
Mm-hmm. Sam, any thoughts on your end? I know your model's different, but how you're thinking about that long-term, short-term in terms of endowment and giving. I know you don't have an endowment per se, but in terms of your giving approach.
Yeah, we're not thinking any differently around our giving approach, and so it's for us is to get the dollars in and to get them out quickly. I call us the anti-DAF, you know, the anti-donor advance funds. But you know, I will also go back to a little bit around what we talked about for grant seekers, and so the foundations and even individuals have two sides of the coin. They have their social investment, and then they have their capital investment, or what it is on their endowment. And so the more that we can think about what it is, why it is that we exist, the better off we're going to be. And as we started to think about raising this $30 million fund, and, you know, like at a time when the market, I took over the organization in January. I think in February, the markets hit an all-time high.
Damn,
End of March,
timing.
you know, I say the founder and my good friend Daniel Lurie that he has impeccable timing. And then by March, it had hit a bottom. And as we talked about raising this fund, we said, well, you know, the market's at a low. And what we came out with is that, yeah, people may have a bad quarter. They may actually have a bad 2 quarters, but they've had a hell of a decade. And so for our endowments and all of the stuff that we're doing, if you had an investment advisor worth anything, you made a ton of money since 2008. And so, yes, we may have a bad quarter or two, or maybe even a bad year, but we've had an incredible decade. And so let's keep our eye on what the past 10 years have been like and what we want the future 10 years to be like as we go forward.
That's a perfect way to end this conversation. I'm sorry we have to. On this last slide, I want to thank Justin and Hilary and Sam for their thoughtfulness, their transparency, for being part of this conversation as we think about all the different ways that we as civil society have to respond. You're about to receive an evaluation, and we look forward to your feedback. We also thank Church Mutual Insurance again for making this free of charge to you. Thank you so much, and we'll see you soon.